Greetings, friends around the world. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Bible News Prophecy channel. It was the best of times, it's the worst of times. It's 2020s, or the 2020s the best of times or the worst of times? Well, I'd like to read something from Charles Dickens' classic tale, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light. It was a season of darkness. It was a spring of hope. It was a winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was far like the present period, that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on being received for good or for evil, in a superlative degree of comparison only. So yes, throughout history, people thought these are the best times, the worst times. What's been going on in the 21st century? I'd like to read from an article explaining why the author believed that 2019 was the best year in human history. If you're depressed by the state of the world, let me toss out an idea. In the long arc of human history, 2019 has been the best year ever. The bad things you've read about are true, but it's also true that since modern humans emerged, 2019 was probably the year in which children were least likely to die, adults were least likely to be illiterate, and people were least likely to suffer excruciating and disfiguring diseases. Every single day in recent years, another 325,000 people got their first access to electricity. Each day, more than 200,000 got piped water for the first time, and some 650,000 went online for the first time every single day. As recently as 1981, 42% of the planet's population endured extreme poverty. That portion has plunged to less than 10% of the world's population now. Every day for over a decade, newspapers could have carried the headline, another 170,000 moved out of extreme poverty yesterday. So yes, it's true that in certain ways, things have gotten better. He also could have added that now you can get foods from around the world like you couldn't do before. There's more transportation options and electronic communications. As far as entertainment goes, many people have cell phones, smartphones, and you can get more entertainment on one of those little phones than kings of the past could. So this is unprecedented. So there are a lot of positives. But despite the positives, many are depressed, many are suicidal, and many people are on antidepressants and other medications. And there are problems that are going to be leading to disasters. I'd like to go and read something the Apostle Paul was inspired to write from 2 Timothy 3, verse 13. This is the New King James Version of the Bible. But evil men and impostors will grow worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. Deceiving and being deceived? Yes. Now I'd like to read some negative things regarding the 2020s or 2019 from Michael Snyder. Will the 2020s be the best of times or the worst of times? The U.S. government is now more than $23 trillion in debt. According to the IMF, global total debt has now reached the $188 trillion mark. U.S. corporations are now close to $10 trillion in debt. Total corporate debt has reached 47% of the U.S. GDP. That's the highest level in our history. Total U.S. household debt is about to cross the $14 trillion mark. According to the most recent government figures, 24.6 million Americans have used illegal drugs within the last 30 days. If you can believe it, 46% of all Americans have taken at least one legal pharmaceutical drug within the last 30 days. That's almost half the country. The suicide rate for the overall population increased by 41% between 1999 and 2016. 23% of all U.S. children live with a single parent. That's the highest rate in the entire world by a wide margin. Today, approximately 40% of all babies in America are born to unmarried women. 58% of American adults under the age 35 agree with some version of socialism would be good for the country. The bird population of North America has declined by 3 billion since 1970. Scientists are telling us that the current rate of extinction, nearly all insects will be gone in 100 years. So there's a lot of negative things. And I emphasize many associated with the United States. I just saw a chart a couple days ago that supposedly almost 30% of the world's wealth is supposedly concentrated in the United States. We've got all this debt and all those other issues going on. So that can be factors. Now I'd like to read something from Natural News The 2020s may be one day called the decade of insanity, given all the insane things believed by a surprisingly large number of people. The frantic beliefs of these people are, of course, driving them to the brink of insanity, such as men can become women by wishing it so, or a human baby that is born alive isn't really active until the mother decides she wants to keep it, or the world as you know it is sustainable and normal and nothing will collapse because that's unimaginable. Finally, the really big false belief is summarized in the phrase normalcy biased. People think the world will always operate as it does now because that's all they know. They're incapable of imagining anything else, such as grid-down collapse, an economic collapse, World War III, a civil war in the streets of America, a food collapse followed by mass starvation, visitation by aliens, and so on. So they lead their pointless lives as sheeple, living out some sort of mad experiment in shared insanity, oblivious to reality that almost everything they think is permanent is actually headed for collapse. Much of what currently functions in the world is entirely unsustainable, and that means it must come to an end. Endless money creation must come to an end. Government debt spending must come to an end. The loss of fossil water to irrigate food crops must come to the end. The ecological destruction of the planet will eventually collapse the food supply upon which we depend. And Jesus warns in the book of Revelation that it was necessary for him to come to destroy those who destroy the earth, because the earth is going to destroy itself. Now, recently, a couple of years back, Forbes actually had an article, and the title was, "The 2020s might be the worst decade in U.S. history." And he said basically because Europe is going to have problems, debts problems, and crazy U.S. politics. But one other thing that he said in the article is, all this is going to lead to the most tumultuous decade in U.S. history, even if somehow, hopefully, we're avoiding throwing a war into the mix. Well, actually, a war will come. The United States will be destroyed, and that may very well happen in the decade of the 2020s. Now, you say, wait a second, people have been saying the best of times, worst of times for all this time, and things have always been like this, and so everything should be fine now. Well, the Apostle Peter warned about that type of complacency. I'm going to go to 2 Peter chapter 3, starting verse 1. Beloved, I now write to you the second epistle, in both of which I stir up your pure minds by the way of reminder, that you may be mindful of the words which were spoken before by the holy prophets, and of the commandment of us, the apostles of the Lord and Savior, knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their lusts, and saying, where is the promises coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. And you continue through there, he talks about the flood and other things happening, but that people are not going to want to believe. And he said he wrote this so you'd have a zeal. Well, the end times, Jesus warned about those who don't have the right zeal, who are Laodicean. Now, what's different about now is before? Well, the amount of debt that we talked about, that was one. And before getting to that, though, in the book of Revelation chapter 13, talks about a totalitarian system, starting in verse 11. And I'm not going to read all of that, but I want to cut down to verse 16. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand and on their foreheads, that no one may buy or sell except one has the mark or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Here's wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, as the number of a man, is number 666. Now that control's not in place yet, but when the Apostle John was inspired to write this in the late 1st century, it wasn't capable. You couldn't control buying and selling, but in the 21st century, you can. So anyway, are these the best of times or the worst of times? Well, actually, a bit of both. It's way easier to do research than it was before. Now, yes, there's biases and all that stuff, but it's still easier. As a PhD scientist researcher, in the old days, you have to go to all these journals and look them all up and find stuff. It was really hard to do, whereas now you can do internet searches and stuff and find all kinds of stuff way easier. But morality issues, including debt, matter. Losing birds and insect populations is consistent with warnings from scriptures, such as Jesus saying that unless those days are short, no flesh will be saved. Furthermore, the Bible teaches that in the end, a highly indebted nation is going to be taken over and plundered. And on an official basis, the United States government is the most indebted nation in the history of humanity. And you say, well, yeah, but they're wealthy. It's wealthy, can't be destroyed. Well, Sodom and Gomorrah were wealthy. We can read about them in what happened to them in Genesis chapter 19, starting verse 24. Then the Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. He overthrew those cities on the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and what they grew on the ground. And why did it happen? Well, according to the New Testament, Jude, verse 7, only one chapter. As Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, in a similar manner to these, have been giving themselves over to sexual immorality and have gone after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. They were sexually immoral and they went after strange flesh. And you can also read about that kind of thing in Romans 1 verses 18 to 32. Why mention this stuff in the 21st century? Well, as it says in 2 Peter 2 in verse 6, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah who were turned into ashes, God condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly. So yes, it's an example for us. You say, well, our leaders think what they're doing with sexual immorality is fine. Well, Isaiah 3 verse 12 says, those who lead you cause you to err and destroy the paths of your ways. Similarly, in Isaiah 9 verse 16, Isaiah was inspired to write, for the leaders of this people cause them to err, and those who are led by them are destroyed. So leaders are ignoring biblical warnings and leading others toward destruction. Now, Jesus foretold something in the book of Luke. Let's go to Luke 17. He foretold destruction of those who seemed to think it was like the best of times. Because it certainly didn't seem to them to be the worst of times. Luke 17, starting in verse 26. And as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise, as was also in the days of Lot. They ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built, but on the day that Lot went out Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. So it's a warning that toward the time of the end, people are going to get complacent. Just like the flood happened, people, and others thought things were just fine. Sodom and Gomorrah thought things were fine. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, I want to read something the Apostle Paul wrote, starting verse 3. For when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, so that day should overtake you as a thief. You are all the sons of light and sons of day. We are not in the night or the darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. The Christians are supposed to watch. But in the end times, a lot of them don't really want to do that. Let's read something else Jesus said. Now we'll go to the book of Luke, Luke chapter 21. Starting verse 34. But take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the cares of this life, and that day come upon you unexpectedly. For it's going to come as a snare on all who dwell on the whole face of the earth. Watch therefore and pray always that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass and stand before the Son of Man. Notice it didn't say, if you're a Christian, automatically you're all fine. No, you have to pray that you're worthy to escape. And by praying worthy to escape, Jesus is also telling you, by the way, that you need to change to be counted worthy to escape. Now, as it turns out, according to the Bible, it's only the Philadelphian Christians that are going to escape that. But even they're going to go into tribulation or subject to persecution prior to that time. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 10, read a promise Jesus made to the Philadelphians. Because you've kept the command to persevere, I'll also keep you in the hour of trial that comes upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. Behold, I come quickly. Hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown. Now, the Philadelphians are the only one God promises to protect. The Philadelphians are the ones doing the work, such as Matthew 24:14 of getting the gospel out, Matthew 28:19 to 20, teaching all things Jesus commanded. working to fulfill Romans 11:25 about the fullness of the full number of Gentiles coming in, and also preparing for the short work of Romans 9:28. Now, regarding the letters to other groups, Jesus said to Philadelphians in Revelation 3, verse 8, I know your works. I've set before you an open door, no one can shut it, for you have a little strength. You've kept my word and not denied my name. Well, the letter to the Laodiceans starts out similar, but doesn't end the same. So in verse 15, I know your works. You're neither hot nor cold. I wish you were hot or cold. So then, because you're lukewarm, you're not hot or cold, I'll vomit you out of my mouth. Because you say, I'm rich, become wealthy, and need nothing. You do not know that you're wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich in white garments, that you may be clothed, and that the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed, and anoint your eyes with eye salve, so that you may see. Before going further, I probably should mention, I was speaking to somebody who was once in the old Worldwide Church of God, and he said he was looking at several Church of God groups, including the Continuing Church of God. And while that sounded kind of positive, he basically said that he'd been misled by some people from the Takachi administration, and therefore he and others obviously needed to be really cautious. And I said, that happened decades ago. And yes, you should have some caution, but by now you should be willing to make a decision. Kind of reminds me of the parable Jesus talked about, the parable of the talents in Matthew 25. He gave different ones. And then to one person he only gave one talent. So start reading about this, Matthew 25, starting verse 24. And he who received the one talent came and said, Lord, I knew you're a hard man, reaping where you have not sown, gathering where you haven't gathered seed. I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, give what you want. So this reminds me of people who are going to say to Jesus, or think, look, I'm a Christian, I was baptized, I have the outward signs, I keep the holy days, Sabbath, Ten Commandments, all that kind of stuff. But notice what Jesus says, verse 26. But his Lord answered and said to him, you wicked and lazy servant, you know I reap where I haven't sown, gather where I haven't scattered seed. You ought to at least deposit my money with the bankers, at my coming I receive back my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For everyone who has, more will be given. He will have abundance, but him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. Cast that unprofitable servant into outer darkness. There'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. But the man I talked to, he still didn't understand. And similarly, with the woman I was communicating with this last week or so, she didn't get it either. In my opinion, she considered church more of a social club. Oh yeah, she believes she's getting salvation and she thinks she's doing what God wants. But the priority of doing the work wasn't there. Now, as far as being cautious, the woman I was talking about was also complaining about church governance. Read Proverbs 22. I'd like to read something here, starting verse 12. The eyes of the Lord preserve knowledge, but he overthrows the words of the faithless. The lazy man says, there's a lion outside, I'll be slain in the street. Notice that God preserves knowledge, but he overthrows the words of the faithless. Those who are overly cautious. Oh, yes, you should have proper caution. Yes, you should be like the Bereans of old and check out what we say against the Bible. When the Apostle Paul told them things they hadn't heard, they searched the Scriptures daily to see if it was true. And that's what you should be doing now. You should be diligent. In Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 10, it says, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might, for there is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you're going. Now, obviously that applies to physical work, but also applies to spiritual work. And Christians need to do something about that. The prophet Zephaniah was inspired to write, Zephaniah 2, verse 1, gather yourselves together, O undesirable nation. Now, according to various commentaries, this is talking about gathering a religious group together. And when are they supposed to gather? Verse 2. Before the decree is issued, or the day of passes like a chaff. Before the Lord's fierce anger comes upon you, before the day of the Lord's anger comes upon you. Now we see that the Great Tribulation is going to come. Only the Philadelphians are protected from that. And many don't seem to think that's important enough. And in Zephaniah chapter 2 verse 3 it says, "Seek the Lord, all you meek of the earth, who have upheld his justice. Seek righteousness, seek humility. It may be that you'll be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger." And who's going to be gathered together? The people who say, we're against all corporate churches or hierarchical governments or whatever. No, they don't seem like they want to gather together. The only ones who are going to gather together as they should are the Philadelphian Christians. And those are the ones who will be supporting the work of fulfilling Matthew 24:14, or spearheading that at least. And that is, "In this gospel the kingdom will be preached to the world as a witness, all nations, the end will come." But I've had people say, we've heard warnings forever, people who seem to be Christians, and they don't have the zeal. Peter warned about that and wanted people to have it. Let's read one other thing from the Apostle Paul. This is from the book of Romans, Romans 13. Romans 13, starting verse 11. "And do this, knowing the time, that now it's high time to wake out of sleep, for now our salvation is nearer than we first believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore, let's cast off all works of darkness and put on the armor of light." Well, to put on the armor of light, you should be supporting the work that gets the work done. If you're called, chosen, and faithful, the 2020 should be the best of time for you. Why? Because you have an opportunity to build character and to get your spiritual house more in order. You're supposed to put on the armor of light and support the work to fulfill Matthew 24:14, etc., the ones I was talking about. For others, the Great Tribulation is drawing near, and most, including most Christians, are oblivious to it. And it is very likely that will begin before the end of the 2020s. So for all of us now, this should be the best of times. We should be learning, growing grace and knowledge, supporting the work, to do the work that Jesus wants the Philadelphia church to do, and not bury our talents, look the other way, say, things have always been like they were, because they're going to change. This is what the Word of God says. If you believe the Word of God, you need to react and act and do the thing that Jesus would want you to do, which is to support the true work of the end times. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Bible News Prophecy Channel.